Have you ever noticed how the greatest stories often begin in the most unexpected places? Some start in palaces, others on battlefields. But the story of Moses, the man who would one day speak face to face with God, begins in the cries of a newborn, drifting helplessly on the waters of the Nile. To understand his story, we need to step back into ancient Egypt. Picture this, the golden age of the pharaohs. Egypt was at the height of its power, with pyramids piercing the sky and the Nile flowing like the lifeline of a mighty empire. But behind all the glory and wealth lay a dark truth. The Israelites, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were enslaved, forced into harsh labor, building monuments for kings who saw them as nothing more than expendable tools. For generations, the Hebrews multiplied, growing in number. And with every new child born, Pharaoh grew more uneasy. He feared the Hebrews would one day rise against Egypt. So, in an act of cruelty masked as national security, Pharaoh issued a decree. Every newborn Hebrew boy was to be thrown into the Nile River. It was a death sentence for a generation. And this is where the story of Moses begins. There was a Hebrew woman named Jochebed. She already had 2 children, Aaron and Miriam, but when she gave birth to a baby boy, her heart was torn in two. By law, her son's life was already forfeit. But could a mother really hand over her child to die? For 3 months she hid him. Imagine the fear, the constant silence, the risk every time the baby cried. The walls of her home became a prison where one sound could bring soldiers crashing through the door. But as the child grew, hiding him became impossible. So Jochebed made a desperate plan, one that would require unshakable faith. She wove a basket from papyrus rides, coated it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof, and gently laid her baby inside. Can you imagine her trembling hands? Her eyes filled with tears as she set the basket on the Nile's current, releasing her son into the hands of God. The basket floated downstream, watched from a distance by Miriam, the baby's sister, who couldn't bear to let her little brother drift away alone. And here's where the story takes a divine turn. That same morning, Pharaoh's daughter came to the river to bathe. She noticed the strange basket caught among the reeds. She ordered her attendants to bring it to her, and when she opened it, there he was, a crying infant, abandoned yet alive. Her heart softened. Though she was the daughter of the very man who commanded the deaths of Hebrew boys, she could not resist compassion. She said, "This must be one of the Hebrew children." But here's the twist. Miriam, the baby's sister, boldly approached Pharaoh's daughter and asked, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and without realizing it, she sent Moses right back into the arms of his true mother. Think about that for a moment. Pharaoh had ordered every Hebrew boy to be drowned in the Nile, yet his own household ended up saving the very child who would one day deliver Israel from Egypt. Moses was not just rescued from death. He was raised under the protection of the royal palace. The Nile, which had swallowed so many children, became the path to his destiny. As Moses grew, he lived a life unlike any other Hebrew boy. Educated in the wisdom of Egypt, trained in leadership, exposed to the splendor of palaces and the language of kings. Yet, in his heart, he remained tied to his people, the Israelites. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, Egyptian by upbringing, Hebrew by birth. But before we get to that struggle, let's pause and reflect. What does this opening chapter in Moses' life teach us? First, it shows us the courage of faith. Jochebed, with no power, no army, no protection, placed her son in God's hands, and God responded by orchestrating events in a way no human could have planned. Second, it reveals a profound irony. Pharaoh tried to destroy the Hebrews by the Nile, but God used that very river to bring forth a deliverer. The enemy's weapon became the tool of God's plan. And third, it reminds us that beginnings don't define endings. Moses began as a helpless infant, abandoned in a river. Yet, that was the foundation of a life that would one day confront kings, part seas, and carry the very words of God on stone tablets. So, when you feel like life has set you adrift, when you feel powerless and forgotten, remember this. The same God who guided a basket down the Nile is the God who can guide your life. Sometimes what feels like abandonment is actually positioning for destiny. This is just the beginning of Moses' story. From a basket on the Nile, he will rise to challenge the greatest empire of his day. But before he becomes a leader, he must wrestle with identity, failure, and calling. The next part of his journey will show us how a prince of Egypt becomes an exile in the desert, and how God often shapes leaders not in palaces, but in wilderness places. Because before you can speak for God, you must first learn to listen to him. When we last left Moses, he was a baby rescued from the Nile, cradled in the arms of Pharaoh's daughter, and raised as a prince within Egypt's royal court. But if part one was about survival, part two is about identity, because sometimes the hardest battle is not with enemies outside, but with the questions that rage inside. Imagine growing up in Pharaoh's palace. Golden walls, marble floors, food that most people could never dream of. Moses was trained in the best schools of Egypt, taught mathematics, philosophy, military strategy, and the art of leadership. He learned to speak like a prince, walk like a prince, and command like a prince. From the outside, he looked every bit like the son of Pharaoh's daughter. But here's the thing deep down, Moses knew the truth. He wasn't an Egyptian. His blood, his heritage, his people were the slaves outside the palace walls. Every time he looked at his reflection in polished bronze, he saw not just the garments of royalty, but the face of a Hebrew. And that tension grew as he got older. Because you see, when you live between two worlds, there's always a moment when you have to choose which one is truly yours. One day, as Moses walked among the Hebrew slaves, he saw something that ignited the fire within him. An Egyptian overseer was beating a Hebrew man mercilessly. Moses looked left and right, making sure no one was watching. And in a sudden burst of anger, he struck the Egyptian down. Not just a slap, not just a shove, he killed him. And just like that, the prince of Egypt became a fugitive. Think about that moment. For years, Moses had lived in luxury, but his heart couldn't ignore the suffering of his people. Yet his first attempt to help them was driven not by wisdom, but by raw emotion. It was justice without patience, action without calling. And it backfired. The next day, Moses saw two Hebrews fighting each other. He tried to intervene, saying, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" But the man shot back, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" And with those words, Moses realized his secret was no longer a secret. Pharaoh heard about the murder, and his wrath was swift. The same palace that had once protected Moses now became a death trap. So Moses fled Egypt, running not just from Pharaoh's soldiers, but from the very identity crisis that had haunted him all his life. He ran into the desert, alone, stripped of wealth, stripped of power, stripped of certainty. And here's where the story takes a turn many of us can relate to. Because isn't it true that sometimes our greatest mistakes leave us wandering in deserts we never expected? One moment, Moses had everything: education, status, a future as a leader. The next, he had nothing but the sand under his feet and the weight of regret on his shoulders. But the desert wasn't the end, it was the beginning of transformation. Moses arrived in the land of Midian, exhausted and broken. By a well, he saw a group of shepherdesses being harassed by rival herdsmen. And even though he had lost everything, His instinct to protect and defend remained. He stood up for them, drove the harassers away, and watered their flock. That simple act of courage opened the door to a new chapter. The women brought him to their father, a Midianite priest named Jethro, who welcomed him into his household. Moses married one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah, and started a new life as a shepherd. Now, think about that for a moment. From prince of Egypt to shepherd of sheep, it's not exactly the career move anyone would have predicted. But it was exactly what Moses needed. Because here's the lesson. Before God could use Moses to lead people, he had to teach him how to lead himself. Before Moses could shepherd a nation, he had to learn to shepherd a flock. The palace gave him knowledge. The desert gave him humility. And without both, he could never become the man God was calling him to be. So what do we take away from this part of Moses' journey? First, your identity matters. You can't live forever pretending to be something you're not. Moses could wear Egyptian robes, but he could never escape his Hebrew roots. In the same way, you and I are often faced with a choice. Will we live according to the world's labels, or will we embrace who we were truly created to be? Second, failure is not the end. Moses killed a man in an act of violence, a mistake that cost him everything, yet God didn't throw Moses away. He used the desert years to shape him into someone new. Maybe you've made choices you regret. Maybe you've run into your own desert. Remember, God often does his best work in the very places we think our lives are over. And third, preparation takes time. Moses spent 40 years in Egypt, gaining education and experience. Then 40 years in the desert, learning patience and humility. Only after 80 years was he ready to step into his calling. We live in a culture of instant results, but Moses reminds us that destiny is not microwaved. It's forged slowly through time, struggle, and waiting. So, as part 2 closes, we leave Moses not in a palace, not in glory, but in obscurity shepherding sheep in Midian. It may look like a detour, but it's actually the pathway. Because in the silence of the desert, God is about to speak. And when he does, it will come not as a whisper, but as fire. Sometimes, the most life-changing moments come when we least expect them. For Moses, it wasn't in a palace, surrounded by wealth, or on a battlefield, commanding soldiers. No, the moment that would change his life forever came in the quiet, empty wilderness while watching sheep. By this point, Moses had been in Midian for decades. He was no longer the fiery young man who killed an Egyptian in anger. He was older now, settled into a quiet life as a shepherd. Day after day, leading sheep through barren hills, searching for water, chasing off wild animals. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic, but it was shaping him. And then came that day. Moses was leading his flock near Mount Horeb, later known as the Mountain of God. From a distance, something caught his eye. It was a bush blazing with fire. At first that wasn't unusual. In the desert, dry brush could ignite easily. But as Moses drew closer, he noticed something strange, something that didn't make sense. The bush was burning, but it wasn't being consumed. The flames danced, the branches glowed, but the bush remained whole, untouched by destruction. Moses, curious, said to himself, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." And in that moment, the ordinary became extraordinary. As Moses stepped closer, a voice called out from the fire, "Moses, Moses." Imagine that, your name echoing from flames that don't consume. Moses froze, trembling. "Here I am," he answered. Then the voice spoke again, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses obeyed. Barefoot in the sand, realizing he wasn't just looking at a mystery of nature, he was standing in the presence of the Almighty. The voice continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At those words, Moses hid his face, afraid to look, because this wasn't just fire, this was holiness. And then came the mission. God said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them. And now I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Pause here for a moment. Can you imagine the weight of those words? Moses had run away from Egypt 40 years earlier. He had buried his past, built a new life, left behind the pain and failure. And now God was asking him to return, to stand before Pharaoh, to lead an entire nation out of slavery. Moses' reaction wasn't bold confidence. It wasn't excitement. It was fear. He said, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" That question, "Who am I?" is one of the most human questions ever spoken, because deep down Moses knew his flaws. He was a murderer, a fugitive, an exile, a nobody in the desert. How could someone like him stand before the most powerful king in the world? But God's answer is timeless. "I will be with you." Notice what God didn't say. He didn't list Moses' strengths. He didn't remind him of his royal education or his leadership training. He simply said, "I will be with you," because in God's plan, the power isn't in the messenger, it's in the one who sends him. Still, Moses struggled. He asked, "Suppose I go, and they ask me, 'What is his name?' What should I tell them?" And God gave him a name unlike any other. "I am who I am. Tell them, I am has sent me to you." Think about that. Not I was, not I will be, but I am. A name that speaks of eternity, of presence, of power that has no beginning and no end. God was telling Moses, "I am everything you need in every moment. I am the God who is always present." But even then, Moses hesitated. He worried they wouldn't believe him. So God gave him signs. His staff would turn into a snake. His hand would turn leprous and then be healed. Water from the Nile would become blood. Proof that this wasn't just a man's mission, it was God's mission. And yet Moses still resisted. "But I am slow of speech and tongue," he protested. He doubted his ability to communicate, to persuade, to lead. And God answered with a question that cuts to the heart. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Even after all this, Moses pleaded, "Please send someone else." But God's patience turned to anger. Still, in mercy, he allowed Aaron, Moses' brother, to serve as his spokesperson. Together, they would confront Pharaoh. And so, from the flames of a bush that burned but was not consumed, Moses received a calling that would change history. Now, let's pause and reflect on this moment. What does the burning bush teach us? First, it shows us that God can turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. To Moses, it was just another desert day, just another bush. But God transformed it into holy ground. Sometimes, the places we think are most ordinary, the workplace, the home, the wilderness of routine, are the very places where God shows up. Second, it teaches us that God calls the unlikely. Moses was not chosen because of his perfection, but despite his weakness. He doubted, he feared, he resisted. And yet, God chose him. That means no matter how unqualified you feel, God can still use you. Third, it reminds us that God's presence is the key. Moses asked, "Who am I?" And God responded, "I will be with you." That truth still holds. It is not about who you are, it's about who is with you. And finally, the burning bush reminds us that God's call often comes when we least expect it, and it often calls us out of our comfort zones. Moses thought he had left Egypt behind forever, but God was sending him back, not to run, but to lead. So, at the close of part 3, we see Moses standing barefoot before the fire, his doubts exposed, his mission revealed. He's not yet the fearless leader we picture parting the Red Sea. Right now, he's just a man trembling before a burning bush. But it's in this trembling obedience that his journey truly begins. Because when God says, "I am," every excuse fades away. Moses' life in Midian had settled into a quiet rhythm. He was no longer the prince of Egypt, but a shepherd, guiding flocks across the rugged terrain under the endless desert sky. He had a wife, children, and a humble home. To many, it may have seemed like the perfect picture of peace. But beneath that calm surface, destiny was stirring. One ordinary day while tending the flock near Mount Horeb, something extraordinary happened. Moses noticed a bush engulfed in flames, yet the fire did not consume it. The branches did not turn to ash. The leaves were not destroyed. It burned, but it was not burning out. Intrigued, Moses stepped closer, and then he heard a voice. Moses. Moses. It was not the sound of wind. It was not an echo of his thoughts. It was a voice, clear and commanding. "Here I am," Moses replied. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." This was not an ordinary fire. This was not an ordinary encounter. Moses was standing in the presence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and from that burning bush, God revealed his plan. He told Moses that he had seen the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt. He had heard their cries. He had witnessed their pain. And now the time had come for deliverance. And here was the shocking part. God wanted Moses to lead it. Think about that for a moment. Moses, who had once fled Egypt in fear, was now being asked to return this time, not as a prince, not as a fugitive, but as the chosen messenger of God. But Moses resisted. "Who am I?" he asked, "that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" It was the voice of insecurity, of doubt, of fear. Moses had lived for decades in obscurity. He was no longer the strong, confident prince of Egypt. He was a shepherd, a man with a past. And now God was telling him to stand before the most powerful man on earth? God's reply was simple yet profound. "I will be with you." But Moses still struggled. He asked, "What if they ask me who sent me? What name shall I give them?" And here, God revealed one of the most mysterious and powerful truths in all of Scripture. "I am who I am. Tell them, I am has sent me to you." This was no ordinary commission. Moses was being sent with the authority of the eternal, self-existent God. Yet even with this revelation, Moses hesitated. He worried the people would not believe him. So God gave him signs. The shepherd's staff turning into a snake, his hand turning leprous and then healed again, and water from the Nile turning into blood. Each sign a demonstration of divine power. But still, Moses protested. "I am slow of speech and tongue." Some believe this meant Moses had a stutter, or that he was not a confident speaker. Either way, he doubted his ability to persuade. God's response was firm. "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." But even then, Moses begged God to send someone else. It's a powerful moment of human weakness. Here was a man standing in the presence of the Almighty, hearing his voice, seeing his miracles, and yet he still resisted. Fear still had a grip on him. Finally, God's anger burned against Moses. But instead of rejecting him, God provided a solution. "What about your brother, Aaron? He can speak well." "I will speak to you, and you will speak to him. Together you will deliver my message." And so, the reluctant shepherd became God's chosen instrument. This part of Moses' story is profoundly relatable. How many times do we feel unworthy, unqualified, or incapable when faced with challenges or callings that seem too great? How often do we look at our flaws and think, surely someone else is better suited for this? But Moses' hesitation reveals something crucial. It is not about who we are, it is about who is with us. Moses thought the mission depended on his strength, his words, his abilities. But God reminded him, "I will be with you," and that changes everything. With his staff in hand and Aaron by his side, Moses prepared to leave the quiet life of Midian. Ahead lay a confrontation with Pharaoh, a clash of empires, and a journey that would alter history forever. The shepherd was about to stand before kings. The fugitive was about to return to the land he had fled. The reluctant messenger was about to step into his divine calling, because when God calls, even the weakest vessel can carry the strongest message. And so, Moses began his journey back to Egypt, not as the man who ran away, but as the man chosen to set a nation free. With the staff of God in his hand and his brother Aaron by his side, Moses began the long journey back to Egypt. Every step toward that land must have carried the weight of fear and uncertainty. Egypt was the place of his past failures, the place where he had been branded a murderer and fugitive. Now he was returning not as a runaway, but as God's chosen messenger. When Moses arrived, he first spoke to the elders of Israel. Aaron became his voice, proclaiming the words God had given. Moses performed the signs, the staff turning into a serpent, his hand becoming leprous and then restored. And for the first time in generations, the people believed. They bowed down and worshipped, for they knew the God of their fathers had not forgotten them. Hope, fragile but real, flickered in their hearts. But hope was only the beginning. Now came the impossible task, facing Pharaoh. Picture the scene. Moses and Aaron, two shepherds from the desert, standing in the glittering palace of the most powerful man on earth. Golden pillars, guards in armor, and the intimidating presence of Pharaoh himself, the living god of Egypt in the eyes of his people. And there, with no army, no weapons, no power of their own, Moses and Aaron delivered the message. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, "Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's reaction was immediate and scornful. He sneered, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." In that moment, Pharaoh revealed not only his arrogance, but also the spiritual battle at the heart of this story. This wasn't just about freeing slaves, it was about revealing who truly ruled heaven and earth. Instead of listening, Pharaoh made life harder for the Israelites. He ordered that they must continue making bricks without being given straw. Their labor increased, their suffering deepened. The people turned against Moses, accusing him of making their situation worse. Imagine how that must have crushed Moses. He had finally obeyed God, finally stepped into his calling, and things only got worse. So Moses cried out to God, "Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued them at all." And once again, God answered not with explanations, but with promises. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go." The stage was set for a battle not of armies, but of power, divine power versus human pride. The next time Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh, Aaron threw down the staff, and it became a serpent. Pharaoh's magicians did the same with their secret arts, but Aaron's serpent swallowed theirs. A small sign, but a telling one. The power of Egypt could not stand against the God of Israel. Then came the plagues, each one striking at the heart of Egyptian life and their false gods. The Nile turned to blood. Frogs overran the land. Gnats swarmed everywhere. Flies filled the air. Livestock perished. Boils broke out on man and beast. Hail shattered the fields. Locusts devoured what was left. Darkness fell over the land. Each time Pharaoh hardened his heart. Sometimes he pretended to give in, only to change his mind once the suffering lifted. His pride would not bow. But through each plague, something became increasingly clear. This was not a contest between Moses and Pharaoh. This was God versus the idols of Egypt. The Lord was revealing his supremacy, proving to both Egypt and Israel that he alone was God. Meanwhile, the Israelites watched in awe. For the first time in generations, they saw their God moving on their behalf. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was not distant. He was here, fighting for them, showing his power in ways they could not deny. But Pharaoh's defiance was unshaken until the final plague. God warned that the firstborn of every household in Egypt would die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the slave. But for the Israelites, there was a way of escape. Each family was to sacrifice a lamb, place its blood on their doorposts, and remain inside. When the destroyer passed through Egypt, he would pass over the houses marked with blood. That night, cries of grief echoed across Egypt. Death touched every Egyptian home, even Pharaoh's palace. And at last, Pharaoh broke. He summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Go! Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested." It was the climax of God's power and Pharaoh's pride. And with this, the long-awaited deliverance had begun. This confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh teaches us something vital. When God calls us, opposition is inevitable. Obedience does not mean the road will be smooth. It often gets harder before it gets better. Moses faced rejection from Pharaoh, disappointment from his people, and even doubt in his own heart. But God's plan was never in jeopardy. Each step, each setback, each plague was part of the unfolding story of redemption. And here's the remarkable thing. Pharaoh thought he was in control. He thought he was resisting God. But in reality, his hardened heart was only making God's victory more undeniable. By the end, no one Israelite or Egyptian could deny the power of the Lord. Moses had gone from a reluctant shepherd to a fearless prophet who stood before kings. And now, with Pharaoh's command, he was about to lead his people out of bondage. The Exodus was about to begin. The night had finally come. After centuries of slavery, after generations of silent prayers, the people of Israel were free. Pharaoh's command echoed through Egypt. "Go, leave us." And the Egyptians themselves urged the Israelites to depart quickly, even giving them silver, gold, and clothing. What had been taken from them through years of bondage was returned in one sweeping night of justice. Picture the scene. Families gathering their belongings in the darkness. Time-bred dough in cloths on their shoulders, children clinging to their mothers' hands, elders leaning on staffs. The air was thick with urgency and disbelief. After all the pain, was this really happening? Could freedom be real? And so, under the covering of night, a nation of former slaves, hundreds of thousands strung, walked out of Egypt. They carried not just their possessions, but a promise. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, but behind them was the God who had proved his power over Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. But freedom would not come without one final test. Pharaoh, mourning the death of his own son, yet seething with rage and pride, changed his mind once again. He summoned his chariots and army, his most powerful weapon of war. 600 of his best chariots, along with all the forces of Egypt, thundered into pursuit. Pharaoh was determined to crush this rebellion once and for all. As the Israelites camped near the Red Sea, they looked up and saw the dust of Pharaoh's army approaching. Fear swept through the camp. The cries of despair rose like a wave. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the desert? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die here. This is the moment every leader dreads, the people turning on you in fear and doubt. But Moses, who once trembled at his calling, now stood firm. He spoke words that would echo through history. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. And then God moved. The pillar of cloud that had guided the Israelites shifted behind them, standing between the camp and the Egyptian army. On one side, darkness. On the other, light. Pharaoh's army could not advance. All night, God was holding back the enemy. And then, at God's command, Moses raised his staff over the sea. A strong east wind began to blow, driving back the waters until a path of dry land stretched between two towering walls of water. Imagine the awe and terror in the hearts of the people as they stepped forward, waves crashing on either side. The seabed beneath their feet dry as desert sand. One by one, family by family, tribe by tribe, the nation of Israel crossed through the sea. But Pharaoh was not finished. At dawn, his chariots thundered into the parted waters, pursuing the Israelites. The sound of wheels and horses echoed against the watery walls. Panic rose again among the people, but God was not done fighting for them. The wheels of the chariots jammed. Confusion spread through the Egyptian army. And then, with one final command, Moses stretched his hand back over the sea. The waters rushed back into place with unstoppable force, swallowing Pharaoh's army whole. Chariots, horses, soldiers all swept away. The greatest military power on earth was defeated not by swords or armies, but by the breath of God. When the Israelites reached the far shore, they turned and saw the lifeless sea. The enemies who had enslaved them were gone. The chains of their past had been broken forever. For the first time, they stood not as slaves, but as a free people. The Bible describes their response. They lifted their voices in song. Moses and the Israelites sang, "The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name." And Miriam, Moses' sister, led the women in dance with tambourines, proclaiming, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea." This moment wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation. God wasn't simply a distant deity. He was a deliverer, a protector, a redeemer. He had brought them out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. But here's the deeper truth. This story isn't only about Israel. The crossing of the Red Sea is a picture of every person's journey of faith. Egypt represents bondage, the things that enslave us. Pharaoh represents the forces that refuse to let us go. The Red Sea represents the impossible barrier we cannot cross on our own. And yet, when God steps in, the impossible becomes possible. He makes a way where there is no way. The Israelites had to take that step of faith, walking into the sea with walls of water looming beside them. And when they did, they discovered what generations would later sing. Our God is a way maker, a miracle worker, a promise keeper. From this moment forward, Israel was no longer just a wandering family. They were a nation set apart, a people delivered by God's own hand. But as powerful as this victory was, it was only the beginning. Ahead lay the wilderness, a long journey through deserts and trials where freedom would be tested, faith would be stretched, and God would reveal himself in new ways. The Israelites had seen the Red Sea split, watched Pharaoh's army collapse beneath the waves, and sung songs of victory on the shores of freedom. But freedom is more than escape, it is purpose, it is direction. And now, God was ready to reveal what this freedom was truly for. After weeks of traveling through the wilderness, sustained by manna from heaven and water from rocks, the Israelites came to the foot of Mount Sinai. It was here, at this towering, jagged mountain, that God would meet his people in a way that would define them forever. Picture the scene. The mountain rising like a shadow against the desert sky, the air still and heavy with anticipation. The people set up camp at its base. For the first time in history, an entire nation would hear the voice of God. Moses ascended the mountain to speak with the Lord, and God's words carried a powerful promise. If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Moses brought these words back to the people, and they responded in unison. We will do everything the Lord has said. It was more than agreement, it was a vow. They were stepping into a covenant, a binding relationship between God and his people. But the covenant would not come lightly. On the third day, as the people gathered at the foot of the mountain, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Thunder roared, lightning cracked across the sky, and a thick cloud descended over the mountain. The sound of a trumpet grew louder and louder until it shook the camp. Fire blazed on the mountaintop, and smoke billowed like from a furnace. Imagine standing there seeing the mountain wrapped in fire, hearing the ground rumble beneath your feet, feeling the blast of a heavenly trumpet pierce the air. The people were terrified. They trembled, knowing they were in the presence of the Almighty. And then, from the fire and smoke, the voice of God thundered, delivering the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not covet. These weren't just rules. They were a new way of life, shaping a people to reflect the character of God himself. The 10 Commandments formed the foundation of morality, justice, and worship, not only for Israel, but for generations to come. But the people, overwhelmed by the voice of God, begged Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." They could not handle the raw holiness of God's presence. So Moses became the mediator, climbing the mountain again and again to receive God's instructions, and then bringing them down to the people. For 40 days and nights, Moses remained on Sinai engulfed in the presence of God, receiving not only the commandments, but also detailed laws on how Israel was to live, how they would worship, how they would treat one another, how they would become a holy nation. But while Moses was on the mountain, the people below grew restless. Days turned into weeks, and without their leader, doubt began to creep in. Fear gave way to rebellion. They pressured Aaron to make them a god they could see, a god they could control. And so, from the gold taken from Egypt, Aaron fashioned a calf. The people danced and feasted before it, declaring, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." The same people who had heard God as thunder now bowed to an idol of their own making. On the mountain, God's anger burned. He told Moses, "Go down, because your people have corrupted themselves." Moses descended, carrying the stone tablets engraved by the very hand of God. But when he saw the idolatry with his own eyes, the singing, the dancing, the calf gleaming in the fire rage, and sorrow filled him. He threw the tablets to the ground, shattering them. Moses confronted the people, destroyed the golden calf, and pleaded with God to show mercy. This is where Moses' role as a leader came into full view. He wasn't just delivering commands, he was standing in the gap between God and his people, interceding for them, even offering, "Forgive their sin, but if not, blot me out of the book you have written." Moses showed that leadership is not about power or glory, it's about sacrifice. It's about carrying the burden of others, even when they fail. God relented. Though discipline came, he renewed his covenant with Israel. Once again, Moses climbed the mountain, and once again, God gave him the tablets of stone. When Moses finally descended, his face was radiant, shining with the glory of God, so much so that the people could not even look at him directly. He covered his face with a veil. The covenant at Sinai was more than laws and commandments. It was the birth of a nation as identity. Israel was no longer just a group of freed slaves wandering the desert. They were God's chosen people, bound to him in covenant, called to live differently, called to reflect his holiness in the midst of a world full of idols. This moment reveals a deep truth. Freedom without guidance leads to chaos. The people had been freed from Pharaoh, but they still carried Egypt in their hearts. They needed more than liberty. They needed law, direction, a vision for who they were meant to be. And that's what God gave them at Sinai. Not just rules, but a covenant relationship, one that shaped their destiny and still echoes in the world today. But as the wilderness journey continued, Israel's faith would be tested again and again. The desert would strip away their comfort, reveal their weaknesses, and force them to decide, would they trust the God who had brought them this far, or would they turn back to fear? The covenant at Mount Sinai had given Israel an identity, but identity alone was not enough. A nation shaped in slavery could not become a people of promise overnight. They had to be tested, refined, and transformed. And so began one of the longest, hardest journeys recorded in Scripture, the 40 years in the wilderness. At first, their path seemed straightforward. God's presence was with them in undeniable ways. A pillar of cloud led them by day, a pillar of fire lit their way by night. Manna rained down from heaven each morning like dew, and quail came in the evening to feed them. Water flowed from rocks at the command of Moses' staff. God was literally providing for their every need. But here is the striking truth. Miracles don't automatically produce faith. Time and again, the Israelites forgot what God had done and turned instead to complaint. When the food felt monotonous, they grumbled, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt." There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. In their minds, slavery with variety seemed better than freedom with discipline. When they grew thirsty, they demanded water with anger, nearly ready to stone Moses. Again and again, their fear and impatience blinded them to God's provision. And each time, Moses interceded, crying out to God on their behalf. Sometimes God provided mercy-sweetening bitter waters, sending manna afresh, bringing streams out of the desert rock. Other times, God allowed discipline, reminding his people that freedom meant responsibility. One of the defining moments of the wilderness came when Israel reached the edge of the promised land. Spies were sent to explore Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey. They returned carrying grapes so large they needed 2 men to carry them on a pole. The land was indeed rich, but fear gripped their report. The people are giants. Their cities are fortified. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. Only 2 of the 12 spies, Joshua and Caleb, spoke in faith. "The Lord will give us this land. Do not be afraid." The people, however, sided with fear. They wept through the night, even plotting to choose a new leader and return to Egypt. Imagine that, on the very brink of their promise, they wanted to retreat to their chains. God's judgment was severe. Because of their unbelief, that generation would not enter the promised land. For 40 years they would wander the wilderness until the unbelieving generation passed away. Only their children, along with Joshua and Caleb, would see the fulfillment. The wilderness became a place of waiting, of testing, of slow transformation. It was in the desert that Israel learned dependence. Their clothing did not wear out. Their feet did not swell. Each sunrise brought fresh manna, a reminder that life came not from stockpiles or storage, but from daily trust in God. But the wilderness was also a mirror, exposing not just their needs, but their hearts. Time after time, rebellion flared. At Meribah, Moses himself lost his temper, striking the rock in anger instead of speaking to it as God commanded. Even Moses, the man who spoke with God face to face, was not immune to weakness. And because of that moment of disobedience, God told him he too would not enter the promised land. There was also Korah's rebellion, when leaders rose up against Moses and Aaron, challenging their authority. The ground opened and swallowed the rebels. There were fiery serpents sent as judgment when the people once again grumbled. But even there, God provided a way of healing. Those who looked at the bronze serpent lifted high on a pole were saved. Through it all, one truth rang clear. God was faithful even when his people were not. He guided them with his presence, forgave them when they repented, and never abandoned them in their wandering. The wilderness was not wasted time, it was God shaping a people who had known only slavery into a nation ready to inherit a promise. There's a lesson here for all of us. We often think of the wilderness as punishment, as delay, as wasted years. But the wilderness is where God does some of his deepest work. It strips away illusions of control. It forces us to depend on his provision day by day. It reveals our weaknesses and also his strength. Moses, through these years, bore the weight of leadership with a heavy heart. He listened to their complaints, pleaded with God on their behalf, and carried the burden of guiding a restless people. Leadership in the wilderness was not about glory. It was about endurance, patience, and relentless faith. When the 40 years ended, they would stand on the edge of the Jordan River, looking across at the land once spied and feared. But this time, it would not be fear that defined them. It would be faith. The wilderness years remind us that freedom is not instant transformation. As the wilderness years drew to an end, the Israelites stood on the brink of the promised land. The dream was within reach after decades of wandering. But for Moses, the man who had carried this people on his shoulders, who had led them through trials, rebellions, and miracles, the ending would not be what he had once imagined. His journey, though monumental, was also deeply human. It would end in both triumph and heartbreak. The Bible tells us that God did not allow Moses to enter the land of Canaan. Why? Because of a moment of disobedience when Moses, in anger, struck a rock to bring forth water instead of simply speaking to it, as God commanded. A small act, perhaps, in the eyes of men, but for a leader chosen to represent God's holiness, it carried weight. The promised land would belong to the people, but Moses would only glimpse it from afar. Imagine the emotions Moses must have felt. He had spent 40 years in Egypt as a prince, 40 years in Midian as a shepherd, and 40 years leading a restless, often ungrateful people through the desert. And now, at the end, he would not step foot in the land that had been the goal of it all. For any ordinary man it might have seemed cruel, but Moses was not ordinary. He gathered the people together one final time. In the book of Deuteronomy, we read his farewell speeches, powerful reminders of God's faithfulness, commands to remain loyal, and urgent warnings not to fall into idolatry. His voice carried the weight of experience. This was no longer the hesitant man at the burning bush. This was a leader who had walked with God, who had argued with him, who had pleaded for mercy on behalf of a rebellious nation. Moses reminded the Israelites of everything they had seen: the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the fire on Mount Sinai, the manna from heaven. He urged them to remember, not just in their minds, but in their hearts. Because memory fades, gratitude fades, and when it fades, people fall away. He called them to choose life, to cling to God, to walk faithfully, so that their children and their children's children would inherit not just the land, but the covenant. Then came the final moment. God told Moses to ascend Mount Nebo, overlooking the Jordan River, to see the land of promise with his own eyes. Picture the scene: an old man, staff in hand, climbing the mountain with steady steps. Below him, the tents of Israel stretched across the plains. Ahead of him, the rolling hills of Canaan glimmered under the sun. For 40 years he had led them toward this place. And now, from the mountain's height, he saw it all. The Bible describes it with a sense of quiet reverence. God himself showed Moses the land north, south, east, and west. Every valley, every city, every horizon. Moses' eyes drank it in, knowing he would never walk there, yet finding peace in the sight. His mission had been to bring the people this far. That mission was complete. And then, on that mountain, Moses' life came to an end. The scriptures say God himself buried him in the land of Moab, and no one knows the exact place. What a mysterious and intimate detail that the man who had spoken with God face to face, who had interceded for his people countless times, was laid to rest by God's own hand. It was as though heaven itself acknowledged the weight of his journey. For Israel, the loss was immense. They mourned for 30 days, weeping in the plains of Moab. Their leader, their prophet, their shepherd was gone. But his legacy was not. He had left them with laws, with stories, with a covenant. And above all, he had left them with the knowledge that God was real, present, and faithful. Moses' farewell was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new chapter. Joshua would rise as the next leader, carrying the people into the promised land. But everything Joshua would accomplish was built on the foundation Moses had laid. The story of Moses' final goodbye is bittersweet. It reminds us that even the greatest leaders are human, with flaws, limits, and unfinished dreams. Yet it also reminds us that God's plan is bigger than any one person. Moses' journey was not wasted. Every step, every tear, every act of courage pointed towards something greater than himself. And so, the man who once doubted his own voice, who once ran from his calling, became remembered as the greatest prophet in Israel's history. His final goodbye was not a defeat, it was a passing of the torch. A reminder that God's purposes endure even when our part in the story ends. As we stand with Moses on Mount Nebo in our imagination, looking at the promised land just out of reach, we can almost hear the whisper, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have led my people. Now rest." When the dust of the wilderness settled and the Israelites stepped into the promised land under Joshua's leadership, the story of Moses did not end. His life echoed through history, shaping faith, laws, and cultures for generations to come. Even though he never set foot in Canaan, Moses left behind something far greater than territory. He left a legacy that still speaks today. Moses was more than a man. He was a bridge between heaven and earth, the one who dared to speak with God face to face. His story isn't just about miracles and plagues. It's about transformation of a hesitant, insecure shepherd into a leader whose words and actions would define a nation. That transformation, in itself, is part of his legacy, the reminder that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. One of Moses' greatest gifts was the law, the Ten Commandments, and the teachings that flowed from them. These were not simply rules. They were a framework for justice, morality, and community. They shaped Israel into more than a wandering group of tribes. They became a covenant people, bound not by geography but by identity and faith. Those principles went on to influence the laws of civilizations across the world. But Moses' legacy wasn't only written on stone tablets. It was written in memory and story. Parents told their children about the night of the Passover, about the sea that split, about the mountain that burned with fire. Every festival, every prayer, every act of worship in Israel carried the imprint of Moses' leadership. Even today, Jewish tradition honors him as the greatest prophet, the one who brought the Torah, the very heart of their faith. His legacy also extends beyond Judaism. In Christianity, Moses is seen as a foreshadowing of Christ, the liberator who led people out of slavery, the lawgiver who pointed to something greater, the mediator who stood between God and man. In Islam, Moses Musa is revered as one of the greatest prophets, a messenger chosen by God to lead and to teach. Across three of the world's largest faiths, Moses stands as a central figure, his life bridging billions of people across centuries. But his legacy is not only religious, it is deeply human. Moses' life shows us the cost of leadership, the loneliness, the sacrifices, the misunderstandings. He was not perfect. He struggled with anger, with doubt, with weariness, and yet, in his imperfections, we see ourselves. He reminds us that true greatness is not about flawless performance, but about faithfulness, persistence, and courage to follow even when the path is unclear. Consider this. Moses never saw the full fruit of his labor. He led the people, but he did not enter the land. And that is often true in life. We may work toward goals that others will complete. We may plant seeds that others will harvest. Moses' story teaches us that legacy is not about personal achievement, but about what we pass on. His leadership was not wasted. It carried a nation forward and laid the foundation for generations yet unborn. Think about the countless leaders, reformers, and visionaries who drew inspiration from Moses, from spiritual leaders preaching freedom to ordinary people seeking justice. Moses' story of liberation has been told and retold as a rallying cry against oppression. The cry, "Let my people go," has echoed in struggles for freedom across the ages, from the abolition of slavery to the fight for civil rights. His voice, though long silenced, continues to inspire. Moses' legacy also asks us a personal question. What will we leave behind? Each of us, in our own way, writes a story. It may not be as grand as parting seas or speaking with God on a mountain, but it matters. Like Moses, we will face doubts, fears, and failures. And like Moses, we have the chance to turn them into something greater, to impact the lives of others, to live faithfully, even when we don't see the final outcome. In the end, Moses' life was not defined by where it ended, but by the journey itself. From the river where he was drawn out as a baby, to the palace where he walked as a prince, to the wilderness where he wandered with his people, every step was part of a larger story. His legacy is not only in what he accomplished, but in what he pointed to: the faithfulness of God, the power of obedience, and the hope of promise. So when we remember Moses, we remember not just a leader of the past, but a voice that still speaks. A man who stood before kings and spoke truth. A man who lifted his staff and saw seas divide. A man who wrestled with his calling, yet never abandoned it. A man who taught us that greatness is born in humility, that strength is found in weakness, And that legacy is measured not by what we hold, but by what we leave behind. And perhaps, as we reflect on his life, we too can hear the challenge to lead with courage, to trust with faith, and to walk with God in our own wilderness journeys. Because, like Moses, we are not defined by our limits. We are defined by the one who calls us. Moses, the leader who spoke with God. His story ends on a mountaintop, but his legacy endures forever.